Well, welcome to you all, and thank you very much for joining us in this new series of talks produced by FOLA and the Gardens Trust. We wanted to explore more around the topic of landscape for housing, which was the theme of FOLA's autumn annual symposium last year. And we landed on castles in the air, aspirations and realities of post-war housing and their gardens and landscape. We know that these talks of necessity will be both broader and more elastic than this title and time frame suggests, and our specialist speakers will be swooping and ducking and diving around and about this topic with us. So hang on to your seats, please. And I'm really excited about all this. So our first speaker is Dr. Catherine Flinn. She has degrees in landscape architecture, architectural history, and garden history and conservation. And then following a professional career in architecture, landscape and planning, she returned to academia with a doctorate in modern British history and is a fellow of the Royal Historical Society. Her research focuses on post-war reconstruction, in particular the political, economic and social impacts of rebuilding and redevelopment. Her excellent and detailed book, Rebuilding Britain's Blitzed Cities, was published by Bloomsbury and is available in paperback. There are many questions about what was going on both during the war and afterwards, starting with all the planning proposals published as books for the redesign of bombed cities. And we're really delighted to welcome Dr. Catherine Flinn to tell us really what happened. So over to you, Catherine.
Thank you. Thanks for the intro. I want to admit, first of all, that, and I forgot to say this beforehand, I actually took the word planning off my title slide for the most part, because when I came to this topic, that's what had been written about, was the planning, and actually not the implementation, not actually what happened so much after the plans were made. And so that's my thing, is how did Britain actually rebuild? So the title of my talk is actually the subtitle of my book, which I think is just 4 words that really describe the situation very well, which is hopeful dreams in the planning and stark realities in the implementation. Now, because I've actually got the luxury of time, I almost always end up talking only for, I get limited to 20 minutes or so. But I've got a bit more time, so I'm going to start by explaining how I came to the topic, because I think it's good for people to understand the perspective I'm taking on reconstruction, because it's not just simply, and I apologize if that's why you're here, but it's not simply about architecture and design, even though I studied it. In fact, it's actually more about what happens before that, on the way to buildings getting built. So to start with, my first postgraduate dissertation was on speculative office buildings in London. And the reason for doing that, and that's the title of the master's on my slide, the reason for doing that was I actually just was really curious. I really hadn't gone into it interested at all in modernism. And I was just really curious, why do these buildings that I originally used to think of as ugly, and a lot of people still do, but why did they look the way, why do they look that way? Why are they so much less interesting, at least to me, than let's say Victorian or Georgian architecture? And then I actually overlapped it with a degree in garden history and conservation, and it was focused on this garden, Thomas Church's El Noviero garden, which is in California, where I'm from. And that kind of extended my interest in modernism, and which I really hadn't gone into any of this thinking that I was going to do. I then read a lot of British history sort of by coincidence, but also right before my degrees, I went to work after university for a huge American architectural and engineering firm called SOM, Skidmore, Ings and Merrill. And at the time I was working in the London office, and we were planning the infrastructure for Canary Wharf. So to me, it's very strange to see lots of tall buildings there. And we were working on the build outs at Broadgate over Liverpool Street. And so I had this perspective of kind of behind the scenes construction administration. And I then got sidetracked from academia and went into working in administration and working with how really literally buildings actually get built. And after quite a few years, I thought, you know, people are not writing about how these things actually happen. I mean, partly because it's boring. It's not a sexy topic to go into, you know, what happened when they did a site survey and they found that there was you know, soil that had to be amended, or they ran into odd construction hiccups, or you know, clients went rogue and changed their minds, or city planners refused to give planning permission for certain things. And there was just so much there. So I then read by chance this book by Maureen Waller, London 1945, and the subtitle is Life in the Debris of War. And it's mainly a social history, but it was really inspiring to me to look at how did people deal with the end of war and the massive amount of change that came through that, not for everybody, but for most people. And there was a piece of the, late in the book, I used to think, I don't think it's an epilogue, but she talked about how more research needed to be done on how London was replanned to be rebuilt. And when I actually then came back to university to study, and with the idea of studying this, which has followed through extensively, I found that London was actually treated so separately from the rest of Britain that I ended up, I keep pressing the wrong way, I ended up looking at provincial cities, focusing on provincial cities. And that really, if I don't talk about London, that's just because London was really treated separately from the rest of the cities in Britain. And they actually were called by the civil service and by government, they were called the Blitzed cities. And I'll get into that in a sec. So I was really curious about what happens when you have all this rebuilding and you make all these plans, and it never seemed to me that the plans were implemented. And the more I studied, the more I realized actually none of the plans, post-war plans, were fully implemented. The closest is probably Plymouth, but tons of plans were made and either scrapped or only done in part. And so I'm going to have to remember which way to go. So I started thinking about this, and I actually have played with word clouds from my book. And so these are a lot of the themes that come up from my research. And I think a lot of people, maybe that's unfair to say, but I think there are certainly historians who go into things thinking that they have an idea about a topic they're interested in, and they look for evidence to back up their idea. I came at this completely blind, like I knew that speculative development existed, right? And I knew that it had kind of come out of the post-war world. There's a great book by Oliver Marriott called The Property Boom that was really essential. And I was really curious, how did we get there? And why did it seem to have taken so long to get where they got? And why did the plans not get implemented? And I started looking at a lot of the literature, and it was really about the plans and not about the next step. And so it's not a sexy topic, and it was a little bit boring, but there was a lot to dig into. So to start with, there were plans made before the war. So for example, this was Coventry. That's a plan, an early plan, although they had started in 1938, and that street was pulled down. And then you have a lot of bomb damage. It's not quite as bad as Europe, but there's still extensive bomb damage in the UK. And so you look at the damage and you look at who and what were damaged and how much. I had to look at also how things were discussed during the war about reconstruction. So that the publication that's showing was published in 1944, because people had started talking about planning for reconstruction right after the start of the bombing campaign, really by 1940. And by 1944, although I don't have a picture of it, there was a Blitz and Blight Act. So the first Town and Country Planning Act, 1944, was implemented during the war to start to figure out what's going to happen with bombed areas after the war. How are we going to compensate people? What kind of what are the finances involved? That sort of thing. But I still wasn't finding why. I knew that a lot of the projects hadn't even really got going until the early 50s. And why did it take so long? And again, why did they end up looking the way they did? So the first thing that I found, and I'm going through loads and loads and loads of files that some people might find extensively boring, and sometimes they were boring, but you're just looking for gems, things that point you to what's the real story here. I'm trying to figure out, how did it all play out? And I find that there's no compiled statistics. There's no real good statistics for how much each city was bombed. So I start to compile these, and I have to make, this is just a random clip out of the spreadsheet. I have to make extensive spreadsheets to try to make sure that I have an idea of, the numbers weren't super exact back then, but they did their best. The planning ministry, which started during the war in 43, did their best to compile statistics. And so I'm starting to get a picture of what are we working with, what are we starting with. And then I discover that there's a committee, this is an investment programs committee that's in a cabinet committee, that is basically, it's a secret committee. And there is a lot of files, but you have to go looking for them. And they are formed to determine where capital investment is going to go after the war, because of course the government's nearly broke. There is a shortage of building materials. There is a shortage of labor. And how do we control, like rationing of food, how do we control where does all the capital investment go? And I come to discover from reading all the investment programs committee, the IPC, I will call it, the IPC reports, that I can see exactly what the government priorities are. And yet this was all hidden from Parliament. This was all just kept within the cabinet. And you can see, it's probably pretty hard for people to read, but you can see the pie chart. The biggest chunk, really, well, the biggest chunk technically is miscellaneous, which has a lot of little things in it. But other than that, the main priority was rebuilding industry and getting production back up, because we're in a balance of payments crisis, and it's a big economic recovery that's needed. And the next biggest thing is housing. The next biggest thing after that is transport, and so on. So, and defense is actually a small part. The health service, there are certain historians who will tell you that the reason that Britain didn't do better after the war was because they invested too much in the welfare state. They'd invested too much in creating the NHS and housing, and that's so not true. There's such a focus on rebuilding industry and production. And so I come to find that actually the IPC is constantly telling the planning ministry that no, we can't do any restarting of rebuilding Blitz city centers. That's not a priority. And they're getting allocated a budget. And then this isn't even a budget that says, okay, we can spend money to rebuild. The government doesn't actually help cities other than helping to fund rebuilding infrastructure. they don't actually fund actual rebuilding. They actually give low interest loans to cities, but what they were budgeting is, and that's what the pie chart is what the value of each building project could be. So they would tell the cities, and they made a list of 18 cities, how much each one was allowed to spend on building projects, right? That's the cap. You can spend up to, and you can see that on here, the highest is, the highest two cities are Plymouth and Coventry, and they're allowed to build up to $500,000 in building value. And actually it was reduced. That's what the pencil on the right-hand side is. So, and that 4 million of capital investment that's allowed to go to the cities is less than 1% of the entire budget for the entire country. So they've spent all this time in the war promising that cities are going to be able to rebuild, and the cores are still full of, you know, cleared bomb rubble, not so much rubble as a lot of people imagine, but cleared rubble, because they're not allowed to start building. And it was the planning ministry who actually put together this list of the 18 cities that were allowed to have budgeted building caps. And there is no evidence actually to determine exactly how they chose those 18 cities. And in fact, after I compiled all the numbers, it turned out they weren't the 18 worst bombed cities. There were, I think, 3 cities that were bombed worse than some of the cities that actually made the list. So it'd be great to know how, but that whatever file that was in didn't get saved. So the IPC is holding back reconstruction in city centers for so long that in 1952, Harold Macmillan is actually the planning minister at this point, and he takes his case to the cabinet, and there's just this great memo with some really interesting quotes. It's actually in an appendix in my book if you're interested in reading it, which it might even be on Google Books, I'm not sure, but there is a chunk of the book on there. And he quotes, he even quotes Churchill that saying, you know, we've got to concentrate on rebuilding these cities that suffered, right? And it's not happening. And so he comes along and he says, you know, we have got to have more budgeted building in these cities. And in fact, actually, he later defies what the Chancellor of the Exchequer had allowed, and announces in Parliament that there's a bigger building program than there actually is. Because I think his take on it was, you know, these people are gonna be voting for us. We want them to be happy. So now the other thing that happens on top of the restrictions from the IPC, the other thing that happens is I've looked at what are their priorities in planning, and this is maybe the more extreme example, but not hugely. Liverpool didn't actually make any plans to reconstruct the way Coventry or Plymouth did, say, to reconstruct their centers as a whole, or Exeter did, or Hull. But Liverpool focused completely on automobile traffic, completely focused on vehicular circulation. So what you find, I actually focus in my book on 3 case study cities, and that's Exeter and Hull and Liverpool, in part because a lot of the other cities that I might have looked at had been extensively written about planning wise, even if not implementation wise. So there's this real focus on the automobile. I can't understate how important it was to cities to be able to get automobile traffic into their city centers at this point in the late 40s and early 50s. And Hull, for example, had this additional problem where they had, I think it was 17 railway crossings, level crossings. And you can imagine if there's a lot of, because Hull is a big port and big fishing industry, but also imports. So they've got huge traffic problems created by all the railways that have to come and reach the docks. So, oh, it actually says 14 on there, but I think there's actually 17 altogether. So between the planning legislation that's created in 1944 and then again in 1947, and I'm sure a lot of people realize it was unprecedented legislation. That 1947 Act really changed how development could happen in Britain. And one of the things that was mandated was that every city or region, and you can check my book for all the nitty-gritty specifics on that, every region had to submit a plan by a certain date. I haven't thought about the date for a while, but I think it was 1953. So cities hired planners. The top left is Exeter. There was a beautiful book produced by the planner Thomas Sharp in conjunction with the city, with full color plans and drawings. The bottom left is the not the first plan of Hull, but one of the later plans in Hull, most of which never actually came through, but Abercrombie, actually Lutchens and Abercrombie were hired to do Hull, and several other cities. Abercrombie also did Plymouth, but Lutchens did pass away during the war. And then Coventry was actually done by in-house planners. They'd hired Donald Gibson as a planner before the war. So several cities actually did hire in-house planners rather than using external consultants. But one of the things that a lot of people like to quote too, and it's funny because his tenure was so brief, but Lord Reith of the BBC was responsible for reconstruction for a very brief period in the war. And he told cities to plan boldly. In fact, I think he specifically said it to Coventry, but he told cities to plan boldly. So a lot of cities thought, okay, this is great. It's an opportunity. We can actually modernize our cities. We can actually get rid of these old narrow streets that don't function for cars. And we can actually make more room for cars, and we can make more parking, and we can make taller buildings, and we can make it function better. So today we look at that and just be horrified, right? A lot of city centers are being pedestrianized. But at the time, there was really this drive to make things work better because they were seen to not function well as, with small, narrow streets and old medieval buildings that didn't have very much space. So one of the things that happens, of course, is the cities are able to eventually, through legislation, they're able to take over land, acquire land, and then lease it to developers, which I'll get into. And then they're able to jack their rates up, because instead of having smaller buildings on these sites, they're now demolished and they're building buildings that have twice as much floor space, which means there's twice as much rent and a lot more room for rates. So it was seen by some, especially by some town clerks, as a kind of cash cow. We can make more money off of this. Now, at the same time, of course, you've got temporary shops, because people were bombed mainly from 1940 to 42, even though the bombs fell all the way till the end of the war. So there's this huge amount of destruction, nowhere for the traders to go. And so most cities put up temporary shops. And this is a photograph from the Hull archives of temporary shops in Hull. And then they were still existing when I was doing my research in Hull. But so that would have been probably 2011. I took that picture. The temporary shops were still standing. I think they're gone now, I'm pretty sure. I haven't been back to Hull since 2013, I think. But keep going the wrong way. So how did the cities actually manage to rebuild their cores eventually? Because cities are basically broke. They haven't been making any money on rates through the war because people weren't paying for destroyed property. And then they've actually got to acquire property, so they're able to borrow at a good rate through assistance with loans from central government. But in the end, it was not just developers, but other multis. So, for example, insurance companies, Woolworths, some of the bigger Marks and Spencer, some of the bigger multiple chains would come in and redevelop a property. And a lot of them had to fight to actually stay in the locations they were in, because that's something I don't think I made a slide about, but one of the problems you find in each city is that not only have you got restrictions from the IPC about how much you can build, and restrictions from the planning ministry on how you can plan and what you can do, and how everything has to be approved. But on top of that, you've got local disagreement. You've got people who don't agree about just the plan, but you've got businesses who want to stay where they are, where they've maybe been for 100 years. And you've got planners who are saying, but no, we've got to change this city core so it works better. And no, you can't go back into that space. And so you find that a lot of plans didn't get implemented because of those problems with, you can't move property. There were ways to actually force property owners to move, and some places did. Anyway, there were some enterprising young men who founded Ravenseth Properties and started going around to Blitzed cities and saying, hello, we can lease your land and we will build on it. We will get the money. We will raise the finances to build buildings, and you will get the rates. And so some of the cities who thought, well, what have we got to lose, made deals with Ravenseth. So they actually made deals in a bunch of provincial cities. Interestingly, one of their backers was someone called Harold Samuel, and I don't know if anybody here, probably there'll be people who know who he is, one of the founders of Land Securities. And Land Securities is now one of the biggest property developers in Britain. And they still hold these mostly 100-year leases. And so the bottom slide is one of the very earliest developments by Ravenseth. It's Exeter Princess Hay, which they broke ground in 1952. They didn't really start till 53. And it was a very modernist shopping area. And of course, it brought a lot more money to Exeter and opened up areas for more choices in shopping than they'd had before. So what you see today is a huge result of cities having to make deals with property developers in order to get things rebuilt within all the parameters set by central government. So here's some of the examples of, in the 3 cities I worked on, of what things look like, and actually in some places still do. The top is Exeter, the bottom is a photograph of Hull that I took. The left-hand development, the left-hand building in the Hull picture is a Ravenseth development. The right-hand picture is actually an entity that the city created to redevelop. And then in Liverpool, most of what happened is people were able to rebuild. There was a lot of buildings left fairly intact that were then just repaired or reconstructed as they were. So Liverpool doesn't have a ton of 50s architecture, but they do have a few big buildings that were post-war. And today you can see that there are actually some places that are starting to pay attention to improving what was done in the 50s. And Coventry is a good example. So I've got this slide of Coventry in 1955, and then I have somebody who actually went out last week to take pictures for me. I sent him some views of Coventry and said, can you get what it looks like today? Because I know they've done, as you can see in the picture, they've done some new landscaping and things. So there is Coventry in 55 and today, and their plan for 1945, and it's pretty similar today. And people may know this, it's actually a listed building, but it's odd because it's very, very, very different from what it originally was in 1960, for example. And then Exeter went ahead and pulled down the Princess Hay, well, Land Securities pulled down the Princess Hay development in the early 2000s, and they built a huge new development that kept the view of the cathedral that Thomas Sharp, the planner, had insisted they incorporate into that Princess A development, which is one of the very few pieces of the plan in Exeter that actually was implemented. So there's now, and you can imagine how happy the city is to have this huge new development from what they got in the post-war period was an improvement in terms of rates for the city itself. And now they're even, sort of bigger and better stores, shops, and multis, and they're getting much higher rates now. In Liverpool, there wasn't a huge amount of 50s redevelopment, but later they pulled down an enormous chunk of the city center in between Paradise Street and Lord Street, and that's where the Liverpool 1 development is. And that's a picture, obviously, of Liverpool 1 and what Lord Street did. One end of it is Lord Street, the other end is Paradise Street. That's Lord Street in, I thought I wrote it down, 1947. So I'm just going to add an example in London. Obviously, people realized that St. Paul's was extensively bombed, the area around St. Paul's, and St. Paul's was lucky to have survived. And there are several developments around St. Paul's, including Paternoster Square there. But the one that intrigues me the most is the Land Securities development. Again, Land Securities had developed the site that's called One New Change, which is on the east side, I think, if I'm orienting it in my head right, of St. Paul's. And One New Change was a very similar development to a lot of the other 50s developments that Ravenseft had done, and it's Land Securities now, and they rebuilt that in, I think I took the pictures in about 2010, maybe. But one of the things that I get asked a lot about, and that I recently wrote about for the Municipal Dreams blog, was comparisons with European reconstruction. Because people, every once in a while, they say, oh, why is, these places in Europe, especially Dresden, people like to mention Dresden, why did they rebuild historically and not Britain? And there isn't a definitive answer, but I just thought I would show some examples where Dansk and Warsaw rebuilt immediately after the war in the historic idiom that had been there, and they actually made an effort to replicate buildings that had existed in their old town. There's a lot of speculation about why. There's no definitive answer, like I said, but the two things that I think are most compelling are, for one, in Eastern Europe, they weren't getting Marshall Plan money, so there's less funding for reconstruction. Not that Marshall Plan money funded physical reconstruction in Britain, other than in industry, but in Warsaw, for example, we know that they were going to reuse the existing infrastructure, so none of the building footprints were going to change, that it was easier to repair and less costly to repair what was there and leave the streets in the same orientation than it would be to change them completely and have to move all of the what you would call the statutory undertakings, or I'd call the utilities, so not having to move gas lines and water lines and electricity. And in Dansk, one of the things that comes up is that it had been a German city, Danzig, and that when it became part of Poland again, there was this feeling that we want our culture back. We don't want to be German. We want to build what was here before we were German. And so it's a cultural thing to try to reclaim culture that had been kind of not wiped out, but changed by German influence and German takeover. And then Dresden is a really odd example, because Dresden actually, in Eastern Europe, obviously they rebuilt in a very modernist way, and a lot of that's still there. But the historic core of Dresden, it's a UNESCO heritage site, right? But it didn't exist in the 60s and 70s. The modernist stuff was pulled down, and then Dresden was reconstructed in, I think late 80s into the 90s, where there's these lovely historic buildings where they've actually reconstructed similar to what had been there. And then this picture is the Frauenkirche, which had been left as a pile of rubble by the East German government, that was meant to be symbolic of the problems of war. And eventually they raised money and they had kept all the rubble, and they rebuilt with most of the original building materials. And that wasn't finished until the 2000s. I'd have to look up the year, but it gets a ton of visitors. It gets millions of visitors, and yet it's a very, very recent reconstruction. And I just thought it would be fun. I like to share this comparison where you've got Dansk on the bottom and a view of Coventry on the top. And it's a little bit, it's an exaggerated view of Coventry, but it's just to show that very stark contrast between the 50s modernist style that most British cities rebuilt with, compared to Dansk, who insisted on bringing back their own culture and their own architecture, and not necessarily focusing on modernism. So I'm just sharing a couple of kind of fun things. One is a cartoon found during my research. Come to Exeter and watch the natives pull it down. So there wasn't actually a lot of outcry about pulling down historic buildings. Some, and in fact, actually the planning ministry recommended that Exeter keep a certain piece of Georgian architecture, a Georgian square, that they then pulled down and redeveloped. But there were people who were upset, and I really like this cartoon about London, rebuilding London, and focusing completely on the traffic, right? London replanned. No harm in trying, right? Yeah, I just thought I'd throw in another. This was sort of when I'm finishing my book, I did a word cloud, and these are the sort of biggest issues that came up, and obviously they're pretty obvious. But those are, you can see there's words like priorities and national and impact, and there's so much detail that I'm not, I'm just giving you a brief overview. So this is the book. That's my Twitter. You actually have to request to follow me for various reasons, but and my email if people are wanting to ask questions. And the book is, I think if I open chat, I will put a link to my book. It's available through Bloomsbury or whoever. I mean, I've discovered that in the US, I can order it through Target. So anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this. I hope you've learned a little bit, but I also am really hopeful that people will ask questions, because I love getting questions about any aspect of this project that took so many years out of my life.
Thank you so much for that presentation. It was absolutely fabulous. I'd like to hand over to Helen to handle all the questions now, if that's okay. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Hi, and thank you very much, Catherine. Very stimulating discussion. I'm sure we're going to have a lot of discussions. If anybody would like to put their question in the chat, I can look at the lists of things that might come in, or if anyone wants to flag up that they'd like to ask a question, that'll be fine. I'm going to start off actually with Dresden. I found it it was almost complete. The cathedral was nearly reconstructed, and it was before they pulled down the cultural centre, which was probably 1960s. a concrete kind of building, but built, sorry, not a concrete building, but a very austere building with massive brass freezers that were doors and faces to the building, with the history of Dresden. And I learned quite recently that the building had been completely demolished, and that there was a bit of a kind of concern about where these massive brass castings had gone to, or metal castings. And I think it really highlights the issues about demolishing, conservation, restoration, and our values, how we place. I just wanted to definitely discuss it with you, like how our own tastes and times, it's very difficult to be objective in a way that really does analyse qualities that should be maybe conserved or preserved, or are not really worth, they're not worth keeping. And then now, sorry, one more question, one more bit to this is, now we've got this big push for no demolition and refurbishment and change. So in light of that, I wondered if you've got a lot of comments to make.
Yeah. So I think one of the things to keep in mind about where we are and how people approach looking at 50s buildings or 60s or 70s, and particularly brutalism, which a lot of people dislike, is that tastes change so much. One of the things that happened in the 60s, as we know, and all over the world, actually, beautiful, beautiful buildings that we now would say are just gorgeous were pulled down. So for example, the Euston Arch, right, disappeared. Euston Station was pulled down, and they put a modernist building that people love to hate. In New York City, Penn Station, you look at pictures of the original Pennsylvania station, it's a gorgeous, gorgeous train station, at least by our standards, but for whatever reason, it was chosen to pull it down and actually put the whole thing underground. They've, to be fair, they've actually rebuilt a new train hall called Moynihan Train Hall, and it is a beautiful space. But losing amazing buildings like that, and who's very good at, Gavin Stamp, I think, has written a lot about the lost buildings of Britain. It's really down to taste changing. One of the things that I've found that, and I'm sure it's in my book, is there were a small group of people, and John Betjeman, the poet, was one of them, who really campaigned to keep historic buildings. But there's such a push for modernism. And I really get the feeling that in Britain, it's because they felt like they were a bit behind. And when they're attacked in the war, they feel like we need to move forward. We need to make everything more modern. But there's also a fascination with technology. There's all kinds of new building systems that people look at and think, wow, we can actually have lots of glass outside the building. People can have bigger windows. And a lot of the modernist architecture that comes in after the war, a lot of that was already kind of in play before the war. And just, there's obviously this sort of pause, right? But like Dresden is really an interesting example. I think one of the things that I think happens especially in Eastern Germany too, is that since 1989 and since the Berlin Wall came down, there's starting to be more nostalgia for what happened in the post-war period. But for a long time, there was a lot of anti-Eastern, anti-communist, anti-Iron Curtain sentiment. And I think that there was a lot of, let's get rid of that and let's put back something more historical. So, but it's such a taste thing, right? Because, I didn't read the, one of the things that I said before the talk was I usually have a slide with quotes from Margaret Thatcher, who says that the planners were at fault for the way the cities live. I wish I had the quote in my head. I also quote Charles, You have, ladies and gentlemen, to give this much to the Luftwaffe. When it knocked down our buildings, it didn't replace them with anything more offensive than rubble. We did that. He said that in 1987. And I find it really odd that people tend to really blame architects and planners, because one of the things you find, and if you read my book, you'll see this, you had to go through so many levels of approval that not only did you have a very limited number of building materials to work with, right? You didn't have a huge amount of choice of what kind of materials you were going to use if you're the developer, but you've also not even necessarily got much choice in terms of aesthetics. So there's a good story about a developer who goes into a city to talk to their building department or whoever's doing approvals and say, draw what you want, because you're not approving anything we're handing you. So tell us what you want so that we can build it. And it's interesting. One of the things that I have said about the book is that there's a hero in the book and there's a villain in the book, and you have to read it to figure out who the hero and the villain are. But there's also a few figures that are really controversial as well, that we'd look at it today and say, you know, how did they make decisions like that?
Thank you, Catherine. I'm going to read out a few questions for you from Michael. Oh, sorry, I've gone and lost it. I'm going to scroll back up. Sorry.
It's always hard to scroll the chat on Zoom. Yeah. I find it really like it jumped.
I'm just going to take them from the top. I'm going to go back to Annabelle's got a question. Could you say a little bit more about Lord Rees? Lord Rees, and what sort of person he was in his
I'm laughing because I'm not surprised that Annabelle's asking that. Okay, so one of the things that comes up in my work is he was a very, very competent person and a very competent leader, but he was really not well liked, and he didn't last long in his position as he was responsible for reconstruction planning. I'd have to look at my book to actually remember the name of the entity. There were so many different ones, but he actually was much more successful, obviously, as the head of the BBC. He had very specific ideas about things, and he was very good at rubbing people the wrong way. So, whereas, you know, the contrast with somebody like Harold Macmillan, for example, who was really diplomatic and such a good politician that he could see who he had to butter up and who he didn't, and where he could go to get what he wanted to happen. So big contrast between those two personalities. But Macmillan ends up becoming, after Louis Silken, who was the planning minister under Attlee, Macmillan ends up becoming really very responsible for a lot of what happened in the early 50s.
Thanks, Catherine. I'm going to go to Jan Mustra. Which of the British post-war reconstructions do you think were the most successful from a sustainability and landscape perspective?
I wish I had thought to say more about landscapes. The thing with the reconstructions is that I couldn't say anything was completely successful, because so many of them ended up being kind of a hodgepodge of pieces of plans being implemented and then changes. And as I know Jan knows, Plymouth was, I mean, if I was going to say success, I would call Plymouth and Coventry a success only because they were able to implement what they wanted, and then that's largely due to the Astors in Plymouth, who had a massive influence on what could happen. But then Plymouth actually, well, it was an Abercrombie plan that didn't really work because it separated all the uses. And actually what makes a city work is a mix of uses. So I would have called Plymouth one of the least successful, even though it was implemented more fully than any other plan, right? But of the cities that were reconstructed, I would have said, I actually think Exeter is pretty successful. I would have said that Exeter, Sharp did emphasize landscaping. So there was more open space. There was more, not that it's in today's taste, because it's not, a lot of it's been pulled out, right? But I think that it probably was a good mix of modernist without really changing the character or at least the circulation in the city center. One of the things, actually, I didn't mention the Festival of Britain, and I would have said that actually that was probably the most successful post-war project, and it's really sad that we've lost so much of it. I think maybe, I don't know if John will talk about it when he talks about housing in the Lansbury estate, if he includes that, but that would, like, and it was only, very theoretical, but it brought really interesting creative designs to Britain. And then really sadly, the Churchill government decided to get rid of it.
Thank you. Thanks, Catherine. I'm going to ask really a question about using archives, since we're the landscape archive at Merle, how you found using, where did you go to? Where were your key archives that you used?
Yep.
The research for the book and your study.
Yep. So I was definitely a big archive rat, and I was one of those who I just wanted to find every possible bit of information that I could find, and there's so much more available online now, by the way. It makes it a lot easier. The biggest archive for me was the National Archives at Kew, where I probably was able to cover at least 75, if not more, % of what they had available that would help my work. Hansard was really, really useful as well, which is online. So, and it wasn't online right when I started, unfortunately. I had to use paper indexes, which aren't as thorough. And then I went to a lot of county and city record offices, and those vary a lot. So they're not all organized the same. They don't all have the same funding. They don't all have the same staff availability. And in fact, when I was there, Liverpool was being rebuilt, and it was relocated into this tiny little space in an industrial park, and it was hard to get to, and so that was very difficult. It had almost no space. So, and actually Hull had relocated into the beautiful Hull History Center. I highly recommend doing research in Hull. Hull is a much better, people used to tease me about going to Hull. Hull is a much, much better city than people think it is, much nicer. Exeter was actually, the records were split between the Devon Records Office and the city archives. And where else? One of the things that I wish I had been able to do more of, and I used a few archives, like the LSE has some archives for people who were in government. So there was a Chancellor of the Exchequer whose archives are there. Those things you have to spend more time chasing down, because what I really, really was hoping to find, and I didn't find as much of it as I wanted, but I was really hoping to find places where Attlee or Macmillan or Butler or Lewis Silkin or somebody had actually made comments on the side or written letters to people or something describing how they felt about what was happening with rebuilding Blitzed cities. And it just was super, super rare to find anybody actually making a comment about it, except in the National Archives, where there's loads of letters, correspondence between civil servants and government ministers, and loads and loads of margin notes as well. So if I had to say which one was the most useful, it would be the National Archives.
I was actually going back to your records that you had on the imagery, on the photographs, the listing of 18 cities. I thought it was interesting that, you know, there was the penciling in of the revised figures, but I'm just trying to remember all the names, but I didn't see anything from Wales or Scotland. Is there?
No, it's interesting that actually, so Swansea is actually, I'm sure Swansea was on the eventually on the list. That the list changed a couple of times, not substantially, but it did change a couple of times. And Swansea was on the list, but no, Glasgow and the docks in Glasgow were heavily bombed, but they don't make the list. If I had, I don't think I have it to pull up, but oops, I could. I'm happy to look up for people. If I don't know if when it goes on YouTube, if there'll be a comment section, but people are welcome to contact me through Twitter or my email. I can say what the actual list of Blitzed cities looks like. I think there is one in my book too. But Swansea's definitely on the list. They were on the list of the very first allocation wasn't by building cost. It was actually by steel, tons of steel. That was initially what they did. And Swansea was allocated the smallest amount, but they were allocated steel in the very, very first allocation.
That's really interesting. Thank you. I've just been able to scroll, so I've got two or three more questions. John is saying, thank you for a great talk. Given British conservationism, why do you think the heritage lobby was so non-existent in the 1940s and 50s?
That's such a good question. That's such a good question. I think there's just this, I think it's the rise of so much technology and the importance of technology in fighting the war that makes people appreciate technology, right? Like the better technology you have for weapons of war, right? The better you can do. And I think there's this sense that it's sort of, I don't want to say a new dawn, that's not the right word, but I think there's this sense that, wow, you know, we can move, like things like space travel were so mind-boggling to people. And we sort of take it for granted now. I think we forget a lot what we take for granted, and we don't take historic things for granted anymore. But there are several really good books about the heritage movement, though, and they are cited in my book. That's the bibliography is available online, but I'm happy to share the bibliography with anybody. But there are a few people who write really interesting, have written really interesting histories about the rise of heritage in Britain. And it certainly really didn't take off until the 60s. I think things like Euston Station coming down are, you know, people were so upset that's really gives the heritage industry a big push.
Thank you. I remember myself going to live in a 1621 house where there were the couple that had it had saved it from complete demolition and loved it, you know, loved and made it. And if they'd not done that, it would have gone down in the village, most certainly. That'd be 68. So the sea change was enormous.
Yeah.
I've got a really good one here from Annabelle, actually, again. It's about what difference did it make to you understanding coming with a multi-professional landscape architecture background to the subject? Should we all be more multidisciplinary?
Yeah, you know, from my perspective, it was just kind of, I feel like it was sort of dumb luck. I just went from one thing that I was interested in to the next. But what really made a huge difference for me was working in construction administration and watching how things really happen. And I think there's a lot of people who stick in academia and don't get out and get their hands dirty. And I'm sorry to call you out, Jan, but just Jan is a really good example of somebody who works in academia in landscape, but he actually has been in the field working as a consultant. And so he understands how things really happen. And I think that's really important. The other thing is that I love to say this to my students, and I think Annabelle will appreciate this. I love to say, nothing happens in a vacuum. There are so many influences that go into everything. Every one of us is individual because every part of our life has been different, even if we have a twin, right? Nothing is absolutely the same for everybody. That's true for a building, for example. There's so many different factors that go into it. So my feeling was, the more you can pay attention to all the different things that impact the built environment, the more you can understand the way it looks the way it does. And that's always been my thing, is to understand why do things look the way they do. So, I think interdisciplinarity is great. It doesn't actually necessarily, it's not appreciated. There's a lot of lip service. But I don't think it's as appreciated as it could be.
Right. Yeah. Thank you. I really appreciated you talking about how you worked on the infrastructure underground of Canary Wharf area, and how going back you have got no connection with it because you've been dealing with all the detail that will actually, service the whole of the area. Yeah. Anyway, thank you so much, Catherine. And I love that, Archive Rat. Very good. A great title, and thank you. I'll hand you back to Annabelle. That's it.
Fantastic, Catherine. That was just it was mind-blowing, really fantastic, really sort of I think you've overflowed the tank and and plugged the leaks and things. And I think there's a lot to think about with what you said. And also you've kicked off our series in a most spectacular, wonderful way, and really very grateful to you for that.
Can I just make one more comment that you've just reminded me I didn't say while I was talking. I did say that London was treated differently from other cities. What I didn't say is I don't think I even mentioned housing, even though you came to me about housing first. Just to say that housing was treated completely separately from what I talked about. It was in the Ministry of Health originally, and then it finally came into the planning ministry, but it was treated completely separately from city centers and business and rebuilding offices and things. So I forgot to say that.
Okay, well, maybe we can come back for talk number 2. Series 2 on that.